think we can start. So I'm going to start with a little bit of introduction. My name is Sarah. I'm founder of SceneStock Rentals. SceneStock is a production gear rental marketplace similar to Airbnb but production gear. We also hold free workshops to navigate how the Canadian film and media production works. You can see the details of our upcoming events on our social media. I'll also be sharing details with you soon. Today we have the pleasure of having Evan Inglis, Associate Vice President from Front Row Insurance. Thank you so much, Evan, for accepting my invitation and joining us today for today's presentation. Would you like to give us a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I just want to thank you for having me. I'll kind of dive into a little bit about my background when I get into the presentation. I'm also going to kind of give you guys sort of a rundown of film and TV production insurance 101 and all the different aspects that build up a policy and the benefits that we can offer you. So I'll just dive right into it, I think. That's probably the best way to do it. I can give you a little bit of a background to start off on who Front Row is. We're Canada and US wide. We're the biggest production insurance broker in North America. And we exclusively focus on film, TV, live events, music, anything entertainment related. We, have a ton of volume and premiums, which gives us a decent amount of leverage over the insurance companies that we represent. So when you reach out to us, you know that you're getting the best quote available from the markets. A little bit about me. So I started my career in insurance about 10 years ago now. I actually started out by going to school and learning about insurance specifically at the British Columbia Institute of Technology, where I got a diploma in risk management and insurance. I've been working in the film and entertainment industry, specifically providing insurance for the last 8 years. And I'm a licensed broker in BC, Alberta, and Manitoba. So if you guys have any insurance requirements that are coming out west, you can always reach out to me and I'm happy to help give you a quote. If you're going to be getting insurance for an Ontario-based project, I can also gladly refer you to one of our Ontario or Toronto office brokers. So, quick disclaimer before I jump into it. All the information that I'm going to be providing you is just for general reference only. It's not intended to be advice on any particular situation. Basically, in all cases, if you have a policy, that insurance policy is going to be primary and the wording outlined is going to outline the contract. So you always want to refer to your specific insurance policy. And if you have a broker, reach out to your broker because they're always going to be able to give you the advice on what coverage you currently have. So just bear in mind, this is all very general info. Also, the information I'm providing is specifically geared for the Canadian entertainment industry. And any information I'm providing you is current up to August 2025. The furthest in advance we can really give you an indication is 30 days. So after that, really market conditions can change, but also, big events can happen that shock the entire world, right? Like COVID-19 kind of changed the way that we cover people for insurance. So yeah, always consult with your broker first. So I kind of want to dive into what an insurance broker is and what we aren't. An insurance broker isn't a party to the insurance contract, meaning that we aren't the insurance company. When you come to me, what I do is I reach out to the different insurance companies in Canada to go out and try and find the best match for your specific risk. So in Canada, there's 4 markets at the moment that we typically work with. We're going to be looking at Real Media, Chubb, Intact, and Sutton. They're the main entertainment insurance companies in Canada, and we have partnerships with each of them. So a little bit about how entertainment insurance policies work and the different aspects that form them. There's 2 parts to buying entertainment insurance. The first one is going to be covering the actual production risk itself. So the dates of filming, as well as pre-production and post-production. But there's also going to be the sort of afterwards where you're distributing your project and liability can arise from the information you're putting out into the world. So the production package is built up of production insurance, which is going to be your first party coverages, things that cover budget overruns due to loss or damage, damage to production equipment or property you're using for the project, but then also damage to locations that you're filming at. Another aspect would be the commercial general liability exposure, which is your obligation to outside parties. So, think pedestrians, neighbors, members of the public, people who aren't part of our project. So the production package can really be broken down into several different policies, whereas the distribution is one specific insurance policy, just errors and omissions, liability insurance. Whereas production is covering your production package, commercial general liability, umbrella, workers' comp, guild, union, travel, accident, drone, aviation liability, and then we can also offer some auto depending on the province you're in. I'm going to do a deeper dive in each of those subcategories as well and just outline the different coverages that are built into them. First, we're going to look at the two types of production packages that we can offer. So we can either cover one specific project, or we can set up a DICE policy, which stands for documentary, industrial film, commercial, and educational content, which is an annual blanket policy that's designed to cover multiple projects over the course of a year. Typically, you're going to be leaning towards production-specific policies if you're going to be filming a feature-length film or a television series, whereas DICE policies are more useful if you're filming shorter film content like small commercials, short dramatics of 20 minutes or less, web series, webisodes, really just that smaller form content. Some of the big differences between the two is that when we're getting insurance for a project-specific policy, it will always include, or should always include, cast insurance for certain members of the cast that if they wind up getting sick or injured, it could cause some serious delays or extra expenses to your production to continue the project and complete it. Whereas on the DICE policy, we don't include cast automatically. However, we can add cast if need be. So how we determine the cost of the policy varies depending on whether you're going to go for the DICE policy or if you're going to go for an entertainment package policy. If you're leaning towards the DICE because you're doing more commercial work, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at your estimated gross production costs at the start of the term. And that's going to determine what your deposit premium would be, which is what we're charging you at the start of the term. These policies are always going to be subject to an audit clause, meaning that at the end of the term, you have to declare your real gross production costs that you incurred throughout that policy period to us at the end, and then we'd adjust your premiums accordingly. So typically, if you're reaching out to us and you say that you're going to have $500,000 in gross production costs over the year, we'd apply a rate to that, and that would determine the cost of your insurance. And then at the end, let's say you only did $300,000, we would determine what the cost for $200,000 is based off of the rate of the policy, and that amount would be returned to you. But again, vice versa can also apply. So if you underestimate and overperform, you're going to owe a little bit of money at the end. Whereas when we're dealing with, I'll just leave it on this slide for a second. We're dealing with project-specific insurance. What we're going to be looking at instead is specifically the budget of the film. Now, depending on which insurance company we're going with, each one does this a little bit differently, which makes it a bit more complicated, but we will remove certain line items from your budget. Things like the general expenses, your post-production costs, the story and scenario expenses, things that if you ever had a loss to your project that resulted in extra expenses, those line items wouldn't be impacted and wouldn't create extra expenses. So they don't need to be covered in the same way. So it just helps cut down on the cost of insurance. So now we're going to kind of dive into the different coverage options that are built into either the DICE package or the entertainment package. There's a whole lot of overlap, so I'll kind of just go over each line item on their own, but they're basically broken into three subcategories is the way I like to look at it. There's your budget overrun due to loss or damage coverages. So these are going to be things that cover extra expenditure in order to complete your project. Be things like the cast coverage, negative film and videotape, including digital media, faulty stock, camera processing, also digital media included, and the extra expense coverage. The other one would be the direct damage to property used by the production. So this would be if you had like rented a camera equipment and you damaged the gear, replacing that camera. So it's going to cover things like prop sets and wardrobe, miscellaneous equipment, so your production gear, rented vehicle physical damage if you rent any vehicles for the project. You can cover production office contents as well as money and securities. And then the last area is going to be your third-party property damage. And this is, again, it's covering filming locations that you're at. So if you scuff up the floors, damage the walls, or create, some sort of worse damage to the property, we can cover that as well. So I'm going to break into each of those little line items to give you a bit more context on exactly what they are and how this coverage can help you. So the first one is cast insurance. This is one of the biggest exposures you're going to have if you're shooting a feature film, because if one of your key cast members or the director were to get incapacitated in some way, so sick, injured, or if they pass away, it will cover the extra expenses you need to complete the project, whether that be waiting for them to recover back to full health and continue the project where you left it off, all those costs you incur to extend your location agreements, pay your crew for extra days, extend your rental contracts, all of those extra costs that start building up could be covered by a cast policy, assuming that we covered that individual. In another scenario, if let's say your lead passes away midway through production, it would actually cover the cost for you to go back and reshoot all the shots you've had with that lead up to the point where things were left off, and then continue the project to completion. Now, it's not going to cover amounts that you were already going to spend anyways. It would be specifically for budget overages. So if you budgeted $1 million, but due to the lead passing away, you had $300,000 in extra costs that you incurred above that $1 million, those $300,000 could be claimable under the policy. So a little bit more about cast insurance. Cast insurance can be quite expensive in the sense that if you do have a claim, the standard deductible is about $10,000 per occurrence. So, you only want to cover vital cast members who would cause over $10,000 in damages to your production if they were unable to continue their performance. So typically this is reserved for people like the leads, main supporting characters, but also you can add people on like the director or the DOP or other key cast members or crew members that you need to complete the project as well. The other thing is that with cast insurance, the insurance company requires you to complete the project. It doesn't allow you to walk away from things if your lead passes away. So the policy limits you there in that you have to have intent to complete the project. The other thing is that the insurance company will require all covered cast members to undergo physical exams and submit either doctor-completed cast medical forms, or depending on the budget, they might also allow statement of health forms, which are just completed by the cast member rather than having to be done with a doctor. And this goes over any kind of underlying health conditions or concerns that they might already have. So if they have high blood pressure or something along those lines, the insurance company would exclude those pre-existing conditions from the cast insurance. But if, let's say, they were perfectly healthy and then they suffered a heart attack, the policy would then protect you for those extra expenses you'd incur. So I just like to go over some quick cast claim examples when I'm talking about cast insurance, because it sometimes makes it a bit more relatable. So the example I like to give is midway through production, your lead actor, who's covered for full cast coverage, no exclusions, contracts pink eye, which delays your filming by a few days. Now, let's say you're halfway through the project and your daily cost is, $30,000 a day. Your lead gets pink eye and it's visible for 2 days, which is stalled production. You're obviously not going to spend the full $30,000 per day for the delays, but you probably already put some deposits down, or you have a lot of extensions you're going to have to make to continue your project. So while you're waiting for your cast member to recoup, you might have to continue paying your crew for those days, or the cost for extending those locations would be covered as well. It's not going to cover medical expenses that the cast member incurs. So, if they get pink eye and they have to go to the doctor and they get some doctor's bill, those aren't covered by cast insurance. You'd have to look at something like workers' compensation. The biggest claim example you can look up if you're interested in knowing more about cast insurance is actually the Paul Walker Fast and Furious claim. It was about $50 million USD in extra expenses that the production incurred so that they could complete their project after he tragically passed away. They spent a lot of money on AI and body doubles to continue the project and complete it in a way that made sense. And they also had to spend a lot of time in the writing room trying to work around how they complete this project. So super interesting if you're ever interested in knowing more about cast insurance. It's an amazing case study to look into. Now, you can go a little deeper with cast insurance. Before I was talking about how cast insurance won't cover abandonment, we can add something on called essential elements coverage, which is an enhanced version which allows the production to walk away from a project if a covered essential element passes away or is unable to continue the performance. This is something that's typically required by a distributor if they require a particular cast member be in the final product in order for them to sell the product. So a good example of this would be, I guess, Tom Cruise in the Mission Impossible movies. If Tom Cruise passed away, you can't really sell your Mission Impossible movie anymore. So the distributor would likely require the production company to hold essential elements coverage for Tom Cruise. And if he passed away, they just want to recoup their losses and walk away from the project. Now, because this offers so much more flexibility, it comes at a higher cost. Typically, it's going to cost you between $5,000 to $15,000 to cover each essential element on the project, and it's going to require much more invasive medical examination. Things like urinalysis, blood work, drug screenings, EKGs, and X-rays in order to get that full approval, because they want to know that this person's in really good health in order to offer this kind of coverage. Now, one other thing you want to bear in mind is if you ever get essential elements coverage, it triggers and you decide that you don't want to continue your project, you now walk away from it. When you abandon the project, the insurance company gets salvage rights to your project, meaning they take on all the intellectual property rights, as well as the right to complete the project or sell the assets as they deem necessary to recoup their expenses as much as they can. So, it's not like you can walk away from the project and then pick it up a year later. Like, you've abandoned that project for good. So the next one down the list is going to be negative film and videotape. This is covering the footage you capture. And if something happens to that footage, then the cost for you to go back and recreate it. So it could cover up to the full production budget if in some horrible accident you lost access to all the footage you've captured. It's going to cover you a full production budget. So this is covering loss or damage to negative tape or other media, which also includes digital. When you're dealing with HD digital, the insurers often require special warranties in order to cover the footage. So you just want to make sure that you're always backing it up, you're reviewing the footage, you're testing all the equipment prior to using it to make sure everything's in working order, because if you haven't taken those steps, the policy is not going to trigger to cover you. The other thing is if you're working with film, the insurance company is going to want to make sure that the producer has recent experience working with film. They don't want to insure people who are really green to film because it is a bit of a complex format to use. They also want to know about your shipping methods if you're shipping it to the States or, anything like that. They want to make sure it's not going through X-rays and whatnot. So the next one is going to be faulty stock, camera, and processing. This is more so if you cause damage to the footage rather than it just being lost, stolen, destroyed in a fire, right? So this will also include operator error coverage. When we're dealing with digital media, this is actually something that we see more frequently nowadays, is the operator error being the cause of loss rather than the format just erasing or something like that. With computers, it's just the risk is a lot lower. So it's really important that you make sure your policy always includes operator error coverage. It's typically sublimited below the total. So rather than being the full production budget, it might be 10% of it or 5% of the whole budget. It is always going to be subject to the digital warranty if you're filming on digital, which is basically that you are backing up to a minimum of 2 separate hard drives before you erase any shot footage or reuse the cards. You're backing up daily you're backing everything up daily to multiple drives that are kept physically separated in 2 different addresses. And this is just to help reduce the risk of fire or theft, destroying all the material you've collected. And then the last one is that you're viewing all the footage in an appropriate format, just to make sure that it's going to pass your quality control. And you usually won't allow footage to collect for more than 5 days at a time maximum. So the next coverage is going to be extra expense. This is going to be covering extra expenses as a result of damage to property. So The example I like to give is I had a client a few years back. We had a big snowstorm in Vancouver, and we're not adequately prepared in Vancouver to cover snow. So the roads get really bogged down and it becomes a little treacherous to drive. They decided they were going to continue their shoot that day, even though it was snowing pretty badly. While driving to set with their production vehicle, it slipped off the road, hit into the medium. Luckily, everybody in the car was okay, but all the camera equipment was damaged. This caused their project to be delayed because they had to not only return the vehicle, deal with all the damages, but they also had to go and pick up a new camera package. So they had to pay for a new camera package. They had to extend their location agreements, and they had to pay their cast and crew for additional dates. And all those extra expenses were covered by the policy because they weren't, part of the initial budget. They weren't expenses they were expecting to incur. We can also cover extra expenses that arise from delays due to things outside of your control. Things like civil authority, meaning a government body preventing you from accessing a filming location. So, as an example, if you had a location that was in a public park and maybe there was a police incident that happened in the park, the police have taped off the entire park and don't allow you to access it. Now you have to find a new location, or you might need to wait until the police incident clears up and they allow you to access the park again. So it might take you a couple days before you're able to actually shoot. Again, those extra expenses over and above what you were initially planning to spend on the project would be covered by the policy. We can also cover things like mechanical breakdown of the camera equipment. So if you've tested all the gear, everything looks to be in working order, you get to set, you go to film, and some of your equipment that you need is broken, you're going to have to go and pick up more gear, and that's going to cause delays. Those delays will cause extra expenses. Again, those extra expenses are covered. All of the other ones you can kind of see are relatively self-explanatory, except for ingress and egress, I find. Ingress and egress means that you're unable to access a location due to a hazard. So the example I like to give for that one is if you have a really remote filming location. Up in BC, we have a lot of logging roads. And when it rains really hard, sometimes those roads get blocked and you're not able to access a location because the road is blocked off. That would be an ingress and egress claim because you're unable to use the expected route to access the location that you needed to. So that's pretty much everything for the extra expense coverages and overspending due to, cast, damage to the footage, and damage to your property. So what we're going to jump into now is actually how we cover the property if it is damaged. So the property insurance, it's going to cover against all direct physical loss or damage. So that's sudden and accidental damage or theft. So the insurance company, especially if you're dealing with rented gear, you need to be very careful with this. The insurance company is only ever going to cover their minimum legal obligation. So when you're renting equipment out, you need to make sure that you always have a rental agreement in force. Sending out a blank certificate to a rental house or to a DOP doesn't establish a contract. It's just simply showing proof of insurance. So you need to make sure that you're always setting up a separate rental agreement as well. So the first property coverage that I'm going to talk about is the prop sets and wardrobe coverage. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's there to cover your props, your sets, your scenery, costumes, wardrobe, and other similar property against direct physical loss or damage during your production period. You also need to bear in mind that if one of your prop or sets is a boat, a train, plane, or some antiques or artwork, there's going to be sublimits and restrictions built into the policy. So you always want to make sure you're very mindful of those sublimits and that you're not taking out like a $700,000 painting that you haven't declared to your broker ahead of time. With regards to aircraft, coverage is very, very limited. So just make sure you're always reaching out to your broker ahead of time to let them know if you're using any kind of special vehicles. That way they can make the insurance company aware. And if there are requirements to get additional policies, we can look into those at the same time. The same would apply for watercraft, as well as snowmobiles or any other special vehicles. The next coverage is going to be the miscellaneous equipment coverage. This is covering your camera equipment and other production gear, so sound, lighting, grip equipment, that kind of thing. It is designed to cover it up to the replacement value of the gear, meaning to go to the store and buy it all brand new, including sales taxes. But again, Typically, when you're dealing with a production package, all the gear you have on set isn't your gear. It's rented equipment from DOPs and rental houses. So just make sure that there's always a rental agreement in force. I can't stress that enough. You always need to make sure that the rental agreement outlines your contractual responsibilities if you were to damage the gear. It's not really so much of a problem when you're dealing with rental houses because they'll typically have a standardized rental agreement that's been done up by their lawyer. But sometimes when you're dealing with an independent DOP, they don't have the same access to lawyers, so they don't have the same contracts built up. So you always want to make sure that you're just setting something up that outlines that, if you damage the gear during production, it's going to replace it. You can always reach out to a production lawyer if you're concerned with this at all. The next one is going to be rental vehicle physical damage coverage. This is designed to cover non-owned and hired autos only. So it's not designed to cover your own personal vehicle, but if you're picking up a production vehicle or a van, we can cover the physical damage that occurs to the vehicle if somebody backs up into a post or hits something and it damages the rental vehicle. Typically, you're going to see that if you're using the vehicle for stunts or precision driving, it's excluded from coverage. Now, it's not a strict exclusion, meaning that we can go to the insurance company and get these exclusions lifted, but it's always going to be subject to additional details about how you're going to be driving, the speeds you're going at, and if you're mounting any equipment to the vehicle. One thing I do like to point out as well when I'm talking about vehicle use is that if you're going to be mounting equipment onto the vehicle, if you're working with a crane, like a vehicle with a crane, we need to report that stuff to the insurance company because any mounted equipment would be excluded from the miscellaneous equipment coverage. Again, unless it's been reviewed and approved by the insurance company. Typically, they want to know what type of mounts is being used, who's mounting the equipment, how much experience they have doing that kind of thing, as well as the values of the equipment, and then what you're going to be doing with the vehicles, right? So, is it going to be blocking the driver's ability to see? Is it going to be mounted externally? Are you going to be operating the vehicle on public roads? Are those roads shut down or are they still open to the public? We need to know all those kinds of details before we're able to get you coverage for that kind of thing. So the next one is going to be that third-party property damage liability. I've touched on this just a little bit before, but this is covering locations that you're filming at. Very much like the rented equipment coverage, you always want to make sure that you have an agreement in place with the homeowner or whatever business location you're filming at, outlining that, you're responsible for replacing anything that you damage while you're on site. Another important thing to note is that a lot of these policies will also extend this coverage to cover the living quarters for your cast and crew during the production period. So, if you rent an Airbnb for your lead or something like that, and they accidentally damage that location, this policy can respond to cover you for the damages that you cause. A very important thing to bear in mind as well is that you always want to make sure that you're documenting the condition of the filming locations prior to shooting. And this is just to make sure that you're taking note of any pre-existing damages to avoid having to make a claim on your policy if, there's already scratches on the floor, the walls have holes in them, and then the homeowner or whoever it is can't reach out and tell you that you'd caused those damages, even though you hadn't. Some insurance companies will require you to do this, but all of them will strongly urge you to do this. Another thing to bear in mind is just be very careful when you're moving any furniture in the home, or if you're wearing footwear indoors, that it's not going to scrape up the floors or damage any hardwood. So for this one, we see a ton of claims coming through, so I always like to give claims examples. What I would say 70% of the damage claims come in as when you have a location-related claim is cast or crew damaging hardwood floor at a home and the homeowner reaching out to get replacement done. And the replacement is always a lot more expensive than you'd think it would be. Typically, you're looking at, like you can see below, like $15,000 to replace the hardwood floor. The other thing to bear in mind is that the deductible on the third-party property damage is applied on a per occurrence basis, meaning that each individual incident that results in damage would be its own claim with its own deductible applied. So if you're filming upstairs and you scrape up the floors, dragging furniture across the floor, that would be one claim. And then if you went downstairs and broke the coffee table down there, that would be a separate occurrence with a separate deductible applied. So you want to be very careful, even if you've caused one damage, just to try and avoid any further damage, because again, each one will be its own independent claim, and those deductibles can add up quite quickly. The standard deductible would be anywhere from $1,500 per occurrence up to $5,000, depending on the carrier you have. So that's it for the production package. Now we're going to jump into sort of liability insurance, which is going over your obligation to outside parties, so people who are uninvolved with production. The standard commercial general liability policy, this typically extends to other operations as well. So even if you're running just an office space, you'd have a lot of these extensions built in, but it's going to cover you for bodily injury, property damage, personal injury, and advertising injury, as well as your products and completed operations risks. It's also going to cover medical expenses. And if you have a rented office space, it can cover tenants' legal liability. If you have employees that you're working with, we'll typically include employer's liability as well, just in case there's a circumstance where you become held grossly negligent for bodily injury to one of your employees. We can also include non-owned and hired automobile liability if you're renting vehicles. So who needs commercial general liability? Every production should have commercial general liability, but there's going to be specific parties that are going to actually ask you to show proof of this coverage. It's typically people like financiers, your payroll companies, municipalities, parks, locations, landlords, and then some rental houses are also going to need you to hold a minimum amount of liability insurance. I always recommend that you just take a look through all the contracts you're signing to get a feel for what the maximum commercial general liability limit required is, and then just buy the policy with that limit to start out with. It just makes your life a whole lot easier rather than scrambling to change a policy midway through, right before you get to a location that actually needs a $5 million limit when you only pick two. The standard limits we typically see are $2 million, $5 million, and in some cases, up to $10 million could be required by locations or financing companies, etc. So this is just a quick example that shows the Film Fund guidelines for Ontario Creates. This is the 2021 to 2022 requirements, so it may have changed, but it's really just a good thing to use to look at. You can see right here that they require you to hold $2 million for commercial general liability, but they also want to see $2 million in products and completed operations. You can send a copy of any of these contracts and insurance requirements over to a broker like myself. We're able to take a look through it and make sure that the policy we're offering is going to meet these minimum requirements and has all the extensions that they're outlining. So, don't hesitate to send us a copy of your different contracts if you don't know how to interpret them. So now we're kind of jumping into how the policy responds. So the commercial general liability is there to cover any amounts that you become legally obligated to pay for bodily injury, property damage, and personal injury. So the policy would include the cost for a lawyer to defend you for covered losses, but it's also going to cover settlement costs if you're in court and found to, owe a certain amount of money to a third party. There is little to no coverage for autos, aircraft, drones, watercraft, snow machines, and other hazardous activities. So if you have anything that sticks out to you outside of being a walk and talk shoot, you should always just run it by your broker, let them know, especially if you're working with drones, aircraft, or if you are trying to get automobiles covered, because we need to do some things on the back end just to make sure that the policy is built to cover it. Specifically with aircraft and drones, we actually have to go and get a separate liability policy set up because most commercial general liability policies have strict exclusions for these items. Typically, your commercial general liability policy should be built to cover you on a worldwide basis, but it's only going to cover you for suits brought forth in Canada and the United States. So if you're filming outside of Canada and the US, we can get extensions on the policy that are designed to cover you in those specific locations. So always make sure you're declaring international filming to us as well. The last thing is, if you have any stunts or hazardous activities, the commercial general liability policy excludes damage resulting from them unless you've run it by the insurance company and they've given approval prior to filming. So, non-owned and hired auto liability. This one's a bit of a tricky part of the commercial general liability policy, and that's because there are so many different provinces and states with their own regulations, so you need to be very careful about when you're relying on this coverage. As an example, in BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Quebec, and I believe Ontario too, they have mandatory provincial auto insurance that you have to purchase. So you always need to make sure that any vehicle you're renting has a primary policy in place with the Crown Corporation that administers the insurance in those provinces, and then our policy would respond in excess to the primary policy that you purchase through the Crown Corporation. Another thing to bear in mind is that the non-owned and hired auto insurance is specifically built for short-term rentals up to 29 days in length. So if you have anything that's a long-term lease, or if you own the vehicle, you should be getting a primary auto liability policy through an auto insurance broker rather than relying on the commercial general liability policy on your production package. Another thing to bear in mind is if you're filming in the US or the UK or other parts of the world, they'll often have local insurance requirements that you need to meet. So you should always be buying a local liability policy, even if it's only a short-term rental in those locations. So now we're going to dive into umbrella liability and where it kind of comes into play. Now, umbrella liability is used to increase the underlying policy's limits by the limit of the umbrella. So the example I like to give is it's going to sit over top of your commercial general liability, your third-party property damage liability, and if you have an auto policy, we can schedule it to sit over and above those limits. And this would be relevant to any production package that Front Row offers. In this example here, you'll see if you pick the $1 million commercial general liability limit, and we purchase a $9 million umbrella limit as well, it's going to sit over top of that policy, increasing those limits up to $10 million per occurrence. So if you ever have any really high location requirements, or if you want to reach a $5 million commercial general liability limit, typically it's done by doing a $1 million commercial general liability limit and pairing that with either a $4 or $9 million umbrella. And that's because it's also going to increase your third-party property damage liability to match the commercial general liability. So if you ever, in a worst-case scenario, burn down the filming location, you have enough coverage to reconstruct the building. So this pulls us up to the last part of the production policy. This is the errors and omissions, which is sold separate from the entertainment package. And it's covering the distribution of your work and any liability that could arise from the information in that project. So think defamation of character claims, libel and slander, intellectual property rights infringement claims. So many broadcasters, distributors, funders will require you to hold E&O insurance as part of your contractual obligations when they're distributing your project or providing you with funding. So you want to be very mindful of that when you're entering any of those contracts, that you take a look over those insurance requirements and make sure that we're applying for E&O ahead of time and that it's meeting their requirements. Some distributors will require you to hold E&O insurance as early as the first day of principal photography, whereas others will just want the policy in place prior to the first date of dissemination. Now, E&O exposure really starts as soon as the public becomes aware that you're working on the project. So if you release a trailer for a project or you release a social media push, you should ideally have E&O insurance in place ahead of that. When we're dealing with E&O insurance, there are two types of E&O policies that we can set up. One is called a claims-made policy and the other is the occurrence-based policy. And they differ in how the policy responds when a claim is made versus when the policy had the actual loss occur. So when you're dealing with a claims-made policy, they're typically sold on a 3-year term, but we can cover you up to a length of about 8 years, depending on your requirements. This will cover you for incidents that occur during the policy period, and they cover claims that are made during the policy term as well. So it's a cheaper policy form because they have an expiration date, meaning as soon as you reach the end of, let's say you have a 3-year term, a day after that term, the policy will no longer cover you for claims that are made. So it's really important when you have these policies to make sure that you're continuing to extend the policy whenever there's an E&O risk, so you're continuing to distribute the work. Whereas on an occurrence form, it will cover claims that are made even if they're outside of the policy term for any loss that occurred during the policy period. And typically a loss is defined as the first date of distribution if you made an error or omission during that distribution. So the example I like to give is if we have 2 3-year policies, one's on the claims made policy and the other's the occurrence, and 5 years after you purchase that policy, someone makes a claim saying that you represented their likeness without their permission and you made them look bad on TV. If you had a claims made policy and that policy since expired, because they made the claim outside of the policy period, the policy is now lapsed and the coverage would not extend to protect you. If you have an occurrence-based policy, however, when they make that claim and it's been 5 years, so your occurrence-based policy's 3-year term is over, because the first date of distribution was during that policy period, the policy would still respond to protect you even though it's outside of the policy period. This one's a little bit of a complicated one, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask me at the end of the session, and I can try and help clarify. I find it sometimes a little easier to explain when you're actually engaging in a conversation for this one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the limits that you'll typically see and what they mean. So on this slide, I'm just going to talk about what each section means, and then we'll discuss sort of the standard limits we'll see distributors and financing companies typically require. So with E&O, you'll often see each claim limit, the aggregate limit, and the deductible per claim, which is often abbreviated to 1 mil/3M/10K or a different variation of that. So the each claim limit would be the maximum amount you could ever claim in any one claim scenario. The aggregate limit is going to be the total amount that you could ever have as a payout throughout the policy period. So if you had 3 $1 million claims during a policy period, separate incidents that resulted in $1 million settlements, after the third one, you would have reached the $3 million aggregate, meaning if you had another claim afterwards, your policy would have already been fully exhausted and you wouldn't have any coverage anymore. The deductible is the amount that you're going to have to pay out if there is a claim. With E&O insurance, it's typically a standard to see a minimum of $10,000 per occurrence or per claim. So these are some typical combinations you might see, and they're also going to have varying policy terms required. Oh, I'm getting a notice that we have 15 minutes left, so I'll try and speed through the rest of it because a lot of this stuff is kind of just rehashing what I've already gone over after we finish the E&O, so I'll kind of open up the Q&A after this slide. Basically, when you're dealing with the errors and omissions insurance, though, different distributors will require different limits. We can see anywhere between $1 million per occurrence all the way up to $5 million per occurrence, and the deductibles can vary, requiring a maximum of 10K, 25K, or even 50K in some very rare circumstances. So just always pay attention. The other thing is we can set this up in whichever currency you require. So if your distributor requires you to hold the policy in USD, you can set up the limits in USD, but just be mindful that the deductibles also in USD as well as the premiums do. So it can actually have a really big difference in the limits that you're purchasing as well as the amount that you'd owe when you go to pay for the coverage. Long and short, those are the parts that form a production package. Does anybody have any questions or concerns that have come up during our presentation here?
And if anyone has, but I do have a couple of questions.
Yeah,
it was a really great presentation. Really appreciate it, Evan. So under the CAF policy, if there is any dispute between the CAF and then let's say the producer, is it covered or no?
No, so that would be more a contractual dispute.
Okay.
So if a cast member isn't fulfilling their contractual obligations, unfortunately, that's not something that we do cover. That would be something more where it would have to enter litigation. So you might have to reach out to a lawyer. The cast insurance is very specifically covering incapacitation or inability to continue working. So, you know, if a family member passes away and they have to go and grieve the loss, that would be something that would be covered. But if they are late to showing up or they just don't feel like filming, that kind of thing isn't going to be covered by the policy.
I don't know if anyone has any other questions, but I do have one more just to clarify. So I think under commercial general liability, you had property damage, and then I remember there was like a similar like I think coverage under the production as well. So what's the difference?
For sure. So it's very intricate when it comes to the liability insurance, and the differences are when you set up a policy with us, it shouldn't have too much of an impact because we're always including both of them for you. But you want to be very mindful if you're dealing with somebody who maybe isn't as familiar with the space because they could be exposing you to losses. But commercial general liability is really coverage for outside parties who you haven't entered into an agreement with, right? So when you're working on a production, there are going to be a lot of outside parties who are either in a contract with you or outside of a contract with you. Right. If you're filming on a set, for instance, you've probably entered a location agreement where you've signed a deal memo saying, hey, if I damage your floors, I'll replace the floors. Because you've entered that contract, they're not a third party in the same sense that the neighbor's building would be, right? So if you damage it, the commercial general liability isn't going to cover it because it'll exclude things that are in your care, custody, or control. So locations, rented equipment aren't commercial general liability claims because you have control over them. So that's why we've set up third-party property damage liability and rented equipment coverage to cover damage to things that are in your care, custody, and control.
Understood. I don't know if anyone has any others, but I think you answered all my questions. I really, again, appreciate it. Is there anything else that you would like to continue with, or?
I can quickly just show you the contact information for our offices if you guys are interested. Here, I'm just taking a look. So you can reach out to me directly. It's evan@frontrowinsurance.com, or you can give me a call. I'm always happy to pick up the phone and chat. My number is 236-668-1499. If you're dealing with a project that's going to be outside of BC, Alberta, or Manitoba and doesn't have any ties to those provinces, unfortunately, I'm just not licensed in those provinces. So you'd have to reach out to one of our other offices. You can reach out to our Montreal office, known as Global X, or you can reach out to our Toronto office. The last thing I wanted to point out is if you are working in a film or TV adjacent field, so you're a rental house, or if you are an equipment operator, you can reach out to us, and we also insure those operations. This was strictly geared towards your film 101 if you're a producer, but if that doesn't meet what you do, we help with everything entertainment. So give us a call.
Awesome. Really appreciate it. So if there is no more question, I would like to announce our next workshop. So it's happening in 2 weeks, August 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So we will be having Green Film Canada, and then we will talk about sustainable filmmaking and why it's important and how it can benefit your production and also the planet. So feel free to join us. I will be sharing the details on our social media. And thanks so much again, Evan. I really appreciate it. It was really educational. And if there's nothing else, I think we can end here.
Perfect. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. Bye.